All right, friends, let's go ahead and dive in. And if we have more folks joining us, we'll welcome them with open arms, but want to make sure that we're using everyone's time wisely. If you're a founder or filling another role in the ecosystem, I have no doubt that there are a million things occupying your mind, and hope that we can use this time to add value for wherever you're at on the journey. I personally am really passionate about this topic. As you might assume by looking at me, I identify as a woman, have identified as a woman my whole life. And I know that for women founders and anyone who isn't part of the typical dominant founder category, that we face a totally different journey. The way that I've described it to other people is that for underestimated founders, when we're out raising capital, it's like we think the game is going to be chutes and ladders, and we show up for game night, and it turns out there's a risk board on the table. So that's why we need to have these types of conversations that acknowledge the reality of what women founders and other underestimated founder groups face beyond the typical gauntlet that any founder goes through when raising venture capital. How can we better equip people for the reality of the venture capital landscape as it exists today, knowing that there are so many long-term, big picture strategic things we can do to change the landscape so that it works for everyone. So our hope today, we won't be able to boil the entire ocean, but hopefully it makes your journey to raising capital a little bit easier, gives you a little bit more confidence or clarity on how you pursue capital, and at the very least, makes you feel a little less alone in the journey. If you're just joining, we've got a couple polls that are live in the poll section. Would love to know a little bit about where you're at in your capital raising journey, and also where you're joining us from on the planet today. So feel free to use the polls and the chat as a way of sharing ideas with each other. And as we go, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, assuming that technology is going to cooperate with me for our session. Okay, if you cannot see a slide that says ready to raise, fundraising for female founders, go ahead and take yourself off mute and give me a shout so that I know, or drop it in chat so I've got an awareness that you can't see my screen. Otherwise, I'll assume that you can, and we'll dive in. So I think it's helpful to start with a little bit of context about who I am, who my team is, and why we're talking about this topic. Further Faster is a venture studio. We're based in Chicago, but we work with early stage ventures around the globe. The teams we work with are pre-seed through Series A, more often than not, though like anything, there's always a couple of outliers. But over the past 3 years, we've worked with over 50 early stage founding teams in a fractional CPO capacity. So we're joining early stage teams as fractional leadership, not just as fractional executives ourselves, but with an entire product team to support early stage ventures and getting from where they are today to real traction, and from traction, setting the foundation for growth. So in addition to working with the 50 early stage founding teams, we've also helped develop 4 accelerator programs and develop 1 venture fund. We're really passionate about making the world of early stage venture work for more founders, because frankly, the world can't wait for really incredible innovation. And I share this slide because it underscores a problem that we all know exists, but is a poignant visual reminder about exactly how little venture capital is invested in female identifying founders. With just 2.1% of venture capital being invested in women, being a female founder is hard. And that feels like an understatement, but I don't think that I've got the language to use to explain exactly how staggering this statistic is. And frankly, I don't think if I did attempt to use language that it would be language that I'd want recorded. So we know the problem. What do we do about it? There's a million different solutions, some long-term, some short-term. And the reality is we can't boil the ocean in one conversation or 10 conversations. But what we can do is start to focus in on what are the things immediately within our control. So the point of view that I'm going to share with you today has been developed by my own lived experience as a woman raising venture capital and working on early stage venture teams, and also the experience that I've amassed over the past few years as one of the partners at Further Faster, who's gotten many data points about what happens for early stage founders on their fundraising journey. Again, it's just one point of view, but we hope it gives you some additional insight and some tactical, actionable things that you can do to make your journey on the fundraising gauntlet a little bit easier. So this is how we're going to spend our time together today. When thinking about how to shrink this topic down to an hour, it was very hard to get to something concise. And I'm still not 100% confident that we'll get through all of this over the course of the next hour. But I hope you'll see this as an invitation to get to know one another and be in dialogue with each other. I'm genuinely committed to changing outcomes for female founders and founders of all stripes. So if there is something here that we don't get to cover in depth or something that you'd like to dig deeper in, I hope that you'll reach out and share those questions, insights, and ideas with me. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to talk about how we evaluate capital sources, the proof that you need to demonstrate that you're ready for venture capital investment, digging deeper in how to tell your story, knowing the obstacles that are coming your way, and then operationally, how do we structure our fundraise? So we're just going to chip away at the funding gap as best we can. Let's talk first about evaluating capital sources. Based on the poll, it sounds like a lot of you are still in the data gathering phase and planning to raise capital. For those of you who are actively fundraising, you've probably already done this thinking, but it bears repeating, no matter where you're at in the journey, that not all businesses are venture scale businesses, and that's totally okay. But we've really, really glamorized the idea of venture capital for businesses and created this narrative that venture capital is the only way to fund your business or startup. When thinking about whether or not venture capital is the right funding mechanism for the company that you're trying to grow, there's a lengthy list of questions that you should be asking yourself. But the first three that I like to center on that are just very high level that we don't necessarily take the time to consider once we've had an idea and are starting to put something out in the market. The first is, what's the scalability of what we're building? We might not know exactly what product is going to be the one that reaches the $1 billion valuation or the IPO or that $100 million exit. And that's okay. We don't need to know the exact product and exit strategy today, but we should at least have an inkling about what that pathway looks like. And if there is even a remotely realistic pathway we can see that leads to those large outsized returns. Because at the end of the day, you're being evaluated as a founder on your ability to deliver 10x, 100x returns on the capital that's allocated to you from your investors. And if the answer is this isn't necessarily that big venture scale business, that's okay. It's better to learn that now before you pursue venture capital and give away ownership in your company. There are so many other ways to fund your vision, and we won't have time to get into that today, but I'm happy to talk about that offline. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that venture capital is the right path for some ventures. So we have to ask ourselves a couple of other questions if we are fairly confident that there is some type of scalable pathway for us. The first is the revenue question. How much money do we think that this venture can generate if we believe that it's scalable? The question around revenue is never one that's too early to ask, even when you're in the idea stage. Having hypotheses about what the revenue opportunity looks like is really important to be able to have the right kind of productive conversations with investors. And then the third question you have to ask yourself when it comes to whether or not venture capital is the right funding source for you is when it comes down to ownership. Sometimes we pursue entrepreneurship to build generational wealth and create legacy for family, something that our children or our siblings or cousins can join us in that could be handed down from generation to generation, or that you and your current cohort could run for the duration of your lifetime. If that's the vision you hold for yourself with the venture you're building today, venture capital might not be the right funding mechanism for you, because the goal of the investor is to reach that liquidity event where we realize returns. And more often than not, you can ask any founder who's stayed on post-acquisition, more often than not, founders do not have the most joyful time staying on post-acquisition for the rest of their lives. So these are three top level things to consider for those of you that are earlier in your journey. There are much more nuanced questions that we should be getting into once we've answered these three. But for the purposes of today, we'll keep it high level. Okay, so we've done the work. We've done the exploration with ourselves and interrogated our goals and needs and aspirations. And we've decided, yep, venture capital is the only pathway for my venture. So let's talk about the proof you need to demonstrate that you're ready. And I recognize that the concept or framing of proof you're ready might feel like it's geared specifically for idea stage or pre-seed stage companies. But the reality is, whether you're raising a friends and family round before you have a real product in market, or you're preparing to raise your Series A, there is a heavier burden of proof that's put on the shoulders of female founders at every single round. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. When you've decided that venture capital is the right funding source for you, that doesn't necessarily mean you're ready yet. We need to be able to go in armed with some data points that make us a compelling and attractive proposition for prospective investors. So you might be ready if you've got strong evidence that you have a meaningful solution. Now, that doesn't mean that you've got 10,000 users on a custom code platform that you've built. Often we know we can spend a lot of time building out products that aren't the right product. So when we say strong evidence of a meaningful solution at the earliest stages, I'm not encouraging you to go build something yet necessarily, but using different low fidelity or analog ways of proving out that you've got something here. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. We also think that it's important to come armed with a well thought out acquisition and growth plan. It's never too early to talk about acquisition, because without a plan for both acquisition and retention, which feeds growth, we really don't have a business. To that point about having a real business, having a clear revenue model and projections is important. Even if you are in the earliest days of building out your MVP, we need to have hypotheses about how this thing is going to make money, because otherwise a bunch of features that people love but won't pay for is just a product, not a company. A comprehensive plan for how you're going to deploy your capital. One of our friends in the investment community likes to say that they're looking to make sure you understand how you're going to turn every $1 they give you into 3 more. And then lastly, but just as important as the other points, is a compelling narrative. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we need to address some of the challenges unique to female founders in their fundraising journey through narrative. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this strong evidence of a meaningful solution. Our team believes deeply in the notion of focusing on minimum viable tests. And there's kind of a ladder here that we think of when we're building companies. The first being minimum viable tests that break down our riskiest assumptions into key hypotheses that we can go test quickly. And the MVT, or these minimum viable tests, lead us to a minimum viable product. Once we've validated some of these early hypotheses through thoughtful testing, we've got this minimum viable product that's out in the world. And if we can demonstrate product market fit and a plan for how we grow, then we've got a minimum viable company. So think about the M's in that way. Minimum viable test, minimum viable product, which leads to minimum viable company. So I don't know about any of you, but in my primary school days, my favorite time of year, in the academic year at least, was always the science fair. It was the one time of year that you could have a hypothesis, test it, completely fail, and still get an A+ on the report card. That might seem pretty basic, but ultimately that's the mindset that we're encouraging you to embody here with these minimum viable tests. And what that can lead to is not just insight about the product, but a well thought out acquisition and growth plan. It's not enough to say that we've got a product that we're pretty sure people are going to love. This isn't Field of Dreams. If we don't have a real plan for how we attract people, there's no guarantee that they'll just come. For any serial founders in the group or people who are on their second venture, I think we can all think back to our first venture, at least I know I can, where we had this idea that if we build it, it's going to be great, and we put it out in the world and people will just find it. They'll be so excited to use it. But the reality is that's not necessarily true. There are so many things, not just products, but people, places, ideas that are competing for an individual's attention every single day, that we need to understand their mental models and what's going to draw them in the first place, where they're hanging out today, where we can meet them. And then once we've met them, how do we bring them into a loop where we're acquiring them and then retaining them? It's iterative and ongoing, and your minimum viable test mindset helps get clarity on your acquisition and growth plan. Minimum viable testing can also give you clarity on your revenue model and projections. This is a short screenshot of a much bigger spreadsheet. And if you haven't put together your revenue model and projections yet, please let us know. We've got a template that we're happy to share with you. And we'd be happy to set up an office hour with our CFO, who is excellent at walking people through the things you need to be thinking about, even in your earliest days, to put together a sophisticated enough revenue model that reflects your hypotheses so that you can have really juicy, meaningful conversations with investors about how you're going to make money. And then this piece, the comprehensive plan for capital deployment. Often we build products without really knowing how much it's going to cost to not only service the customers that we acquire, but to maintain the product that we build. If we can get very clear on what the product is that we need to build in order to generate revenue, acquire and retain users, then we can figure out not just how much it costs to build, but how we need to allocate our talent team. Who do we need to hire to make sure that that product runs smoothly for both the customer and for the technology? Your investor wants to know exactly how this money is going to be translated. And if we don't have a comprehensive plan for all of the facets of the business, there's an ability for the investor to poke holes on the rigor around your preparation and planning. Taking a minimum viable test mindset gives us really good early data points that we can plug into our models that enables us to tell our story. So some of the things that we might be looking for on the investor side that you can talk about through the minimum viable testing framework is not just how you'd be allocating dollars across talent, development, operations, and marketing, but having some core hypotheses around your traction channels, what your customer acquisition costs or CAC might be, and maybe even some insight about the lifetime value of a user. So that's a quick clip through minimum viable testing mindset and how we think about minimum viable testing and minimum viable product, and in turn, minimum viable company. That concept is something that I can nerd out about for hours. So in the interest of time, we're going to keep it moving. But like I said, I'm happy to do a one-on-one with anybody who's got questions that emerges about this notion of product market fit and the minimums that we talked about. So let's talk about telling your story. There are some core tenets to a successful pitch that maybe we don't talk about often enough. There is this idea that if you ask for advice, you get money twice. You've probably heard from other people this idea of building real relationships with prospective investors. And when I first heard that in my first company, it felt really intimidating. Why would anyone want to hear from me? What if I'm not good enough or ready yet for their investment dollars? But the reality is that investors want to hear from you. They only win if they get exposure to the most promising, most innovative companies, and getting exposure to deal flow is their entire job. So when you think about this idea of getting advice, asking for advice, and getting money twice, there are a number of different ways to do it. But reaching out even before you're ready, when you can identify investors whose thesis matches the problem area that you're trying to solve, and ask for advice. Demonstrate this minimum viable testing mindset because they know the market that you're approaching intimately, and tell them, this is the hypothesis or the assumption that I'm holding. This is how I'm going to go test it. What advice do you have? What insights do you have? What am I not thinking about? And once you've built that rapport and gotten their advice, once you go out and test, that gives you an opportunity to come back and show them what you're learning and ask for their advice again. As you build these types of relationships and create these types of feedback loops with investors, once it comes time to actually ask for the money, they're invested in you because they've given you advice and they've seen how you can execute. A pitch is an open, not a close. So think about it as a starting point for your relationship. It's also important to own where you are. And I know that can be hard, especially knowing that the questions that female founders get asked already have a bias that assumes that we're not as far along as we need to be. But my frame on entrepreneurship always is holding the tension between hubris and humility. We have to have the hubris to believe that we can do something bold and daring and that there's real potential in what we're out to build. Also being humble enough to acknowledge where you're still learning and growing, both as a founder and as a company, but being able to position it in a growth-oriented way is the sweet spot in the Venn diagram that we're trying to find. Many investors have a finely tuned BS meter, and if you overinflate where you're at on the journey, they'll sense it. And as a female founder, they may already have a bias to be looking for the ways in which you might not be 100% accurate with what you're saying in a way they might not be assessing our male counterparts. This goes back to minimum viable testing. When you're telling your pitch, underscoring what you've learned, how you're learning it, and how you're going to continue to test and learn so that you're being a diligent steward of their capital is really important. So pre-investment goes back to what I was saying before. Create the kind of relationship where you're getting advice and sharing back insight. Another key part of a successful pitch is keeping it simple. And I know this can be hard when we're subject matter experts and we know that every single facet of the problem and our solution and our future plans is actually really essential. But we need to put our shoes on, or put our investor hat on, and put ourselves in the shoes of the person who's evaluating our company for investment. In the way that we empathize with our end user, we also have to empathize with our investor here and make sure that we're focusing on a single point on each slide and limiting the jargon and getting very clear on the things they care about most, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's a million examples of really good, clean, clear decks that are out in the world. And if you're looking for specific examples, send me an email and I'd be happy to send some your way. Now, this next point, I think, can maybe raise some hairs on the back of your neck. I know it did for me, but this notion of telling an emotional story that gets someone invested and being a part of solving the problem, especially depending on the solution that you're bringing out to the world. Women very unfairly get characterized as overly emotional. But what we want to do here is find that moment of human connection for the investor with the user who's experiencing the problem. So giving the founder a front row seat into what the day-to-day life looks like for the person who's experiencing the problem and how the world is impacted by that is really important. And then this is one of my favorite points, which is a maniacal focus on painkillers. I don't know if anyone else has spent any time in an urgent care or an emergency room, but when you step into that triage space and they assess you, there's a visual on the wall with a Likert scale of 1 to 10. And at the 1, there's a happy smiley face. And at the 10, there's an angry, sad, red face. That 10 is urgent 911 pain. And what we're trying to underscore with investors is that not only have we surfaced an 8, 9, 10 level pain, we also have the kind of painkiller that can solve that and bring that person back down to a 1 or a 2. We have to be able to demonstrate that there's enough urgency that our user is experiencing that they are willing to not only adopt our product, but pay for it because we've made a meaningful difference in their lives. And if you're at the earliest stages of your journey where you don't have revenue yet, this is where that minimum viable test mindset becomes so critical to develop. If we can show some early tests that validate our hypotheses about how we're delivering our painkiller and the degree to which we're solving the pain for our user, that should inspire some confidence in your investor. And then lastly, there are going to be things that are thrown your way, and being armed with some quick answers before you start writing anything, because these are the things that are going to be lobbed at you. What do they need to know? Very quickly off the top of your head. And if you're in the early planning phases right now, maybe while we're sitting here together, writing down these answers for yourself. What does your investor need to know? What do they need to feel? And what do they need to do? Before we segue to deck outline, an important point here about delivering pitches. If you are just getting started and haven't done pitches yet, I think there's an expectation in the way that we see entrepreneurship portrayed that we go in guns a-blazing with our decks and go slide by slide, all 17 to 20 slides. And the reality is, the focus needs to be on relationship over deck content. If you've gotten to a call with the investor, odds are they've already flipped through your deck and have seen what's there. In our first call in particular, they want to get to know you. Who are you as an executive? What kind of vision and executive habits are you bringing to the table? And how do you see the opportunity as a human and as a leader? You can ask if the investor wants to walk through the deck, but more often than not, they won't. And even if you don't ask, they'll tell you if that's what they want. Otherwise, assume that the first conversation is about referencing the deck, not walking through it step by step. So let's talk a little bit about what's in a good deck. Like I said before, we want to be clear, concise, and tell the opportunity to the investor. So this is the guidance that we give our founders, whether they're coming to us with no deck or need to revise the deck based on learnings and stage. In sequential order from the left column through the right, this is how we advocate outlining your deck. When you're putting your deck together and you're out there giving pitches, You'll probably at each round give hundreds of pitches, at least through Series A. And each person that you talk to is going to have feedback on the deck as you build it. There's an inclination after every conversation to tweak and adjust. If I have a conversation with my colleague Lizzie, who's joining us today, if I have a conversation with Lizzie and she gives me 3 data points and I make the adjustments based on what she says as one of my prospective investors, and then I have a conversation with Bridget, who's another investor, and her feedback conflicts with Lizzie's, and I make the tweak in a different direction. And then my third conversation is with Karen, who has wildly different feedback. I'm not giving myself the chance to see patterns before making adjustments. So when you put your deck together, we encourage you to follow this outline and create a pitch script that matches the deck, but wait until you've gotten 5, 10 reps with the existing deck and the existing pitch before you go in and tweak it, because this is how we see patterns that emerge, and we can make thoughtful iterations to our decks and our pitches without losing our sanity. And I know that that can be really tricky because it is very easy to lose one's sanity in the fundraising process, because not only are we fundraising, which is its own full-time job, we're also running our companies. It took me a while to learn that lesson, so I hope that saves some of you some heartache. As you're thinking about your pitch and how you tell your story, I want to underscore a couple things that are part of the zeitgeist right now and have entered our collective consciousness in terms of what female founders might or are very likely to face on their fundraising journey. Many of us might be aware of this concept of signaling. And for those of you who haven't heard about signaling before, this is especially germane if you are in the idea stage or raising a pre-seed or seed round right now. But when you're very early on and don't have very many data points, like you would at Series A or Series B around real lifetime value of a user, your acquisition costs, your retention rates, they're looking for other signals that indicate that there's real market opportunity here. I want to acknowledge that a lot of signaling is laden with bias, but these are the mental models that many investors hold. So while we're eager to find ways to shift those mental models, we also have to be strategically prepared to meet the mental models as they exist today. Venture capital is a volume game, and they're looking for pattern recognition. So let's talk about some of the signals that investors might be looking for. And for those of you who hang out on Twitter, you may follow OpenVC. You may have seen this thread. And right, wrong, or otherwise, these are the ways that investors are thinking about signals. There's the idea that you could have 10 investors and have 30 opinions about the same company, but this is a good starting point if you aren't familiar with the concept of signals and how you might embed them in your storytelling and your deck, to take a beat and think about how you might introduce strong signals or overcome the perception of something being a weak signal or a red flag. I won't read the screen to you, but the general concept here is that there's a bias towards action and quantifiable metrics. If you think about putting together a resume and putting together your first few resumes, I'm sure many of us received the advice in our careers, don't tell me what you did, tell me the outcomes. So rather than saying I implemented a file system, saying I created and maintained a file system that led to 40% more efficiency and accuracy in patient records is much more compelling. So when we're talking about signals, there's really this bias for an action orientation. What was the action? What were the outcomes that tell a story about the improvement that was created by your product or the learnings that you amassed? There's also some signals that they're looking for in terms of team. We can debate, and I've got strong opinions about this, that 2x exited founder isn't necessarily a strong signal. We know there are a lot of bad actors in the ecosystem, or people who've had an exit that doesn't necessarily indicate their ability to lead a company, because not all exits are created equal. And there are going to be things that are really essential for us to be able to do in order to create our startups. For example, a red flag or a weak signal that might be perceived is if you aren't doing this full time. It's an unfortunate reality that some investors hold the belief that you can't be serious about the venture if you aren't full time. The reality is, for many of us, we need to have other capital sources until we've got the revenue or investment capital from VC or other vehicles to enable us to focus on the startup full time. So thinking about how to overcome things that are perceived as weak signal, like telling the story about our projections and how much revenue it will take for the company to grow, and in turn, weaving your salary into the projection model for the next 12 to 18 months allows us to tell the story about what capital is needed for you to be in the work full time. That's just one example, and happy to talk more about signals and how we might prepare for them or weave them through our narrative. If we don't get to talk about it in depth here, always happy to talk about that in a follow-up. The other thing that I want to talk about is prevention versus promotion questions. Some of you may have experienced this firsthand already in your journey. Some of you may have heard about this anecdotally from other founders in your universe, or read all of the data that's out in the world today about this. Unfortunately, the data set isn't as robust as we'd like, and it doesn't take into account other identities, but this is through the lens of a male-female binary construct about the two different types of questions that are framed for male and female founders. What one set of research identified is that male founders received vision questions 66% of the time. On the converse, female founders received prevention questions 67% of the time. So this means that there's already implicit bias and skepticism around a female founder's ability to succeed. So how do we prepare to answer? Here, I thought this table from Harvard Business Review gave us some good insight about what this looks like in practice. A promotion question, right? Something along the lines of, how do you want to acquire customers, or how do you see growing your user base, can quickly devolve into, on the prevention side, how many active users do you have? What's your retention rate? And especially at your earliest days, it's really hard to answer those questions. If you've only gotten MVP and have done a private alpha or a beta, you're not going to have great retention numbers to talk about. Or maybe you do, but the skepticism will still be there around the quality of the numbers. So transforming that energy and turning a prevention question into something you can respond to with a promotion answer is an art form that and a skill set you cultivate over time. There aren't a lot of great resources about how we do that. So one thing that I did before our time together today was reach out to some of the female founders in my network who've raised seed and Series A rounds and ask them about what it looked like in their fundraising journeys. I only had my experience to go off of, but given the dearth of tactical training out there about how we translate prevention questions into promotion answers, I thought some insights from other people who've been on the journey would be helpful. Everyone will have access to this deck after the presentation, so no need to read this with a fine-tooth comb, but I'm going to call out a few highlights. One thing that's true is we know that we have to be overly prepared. Unless you're Adam Newman, you're not going to be able to walk into an investor's office with an idea and a slide deck. And, granted, there's varying opinions on how far the concept that Adam has raised around how far developed that is. But at the end of the day, we know that very, very few of us, I'd venture to say probably none of us on this call today are able to just walk in and get hundreds of millions of dollars. So being overly prepared and practice with your peers is huge. It's helpful to create a list of those prevention questions that you might receive and actually write out the promotion answer you would use to respond to it. Over communicating your testing, and this is why I'm such a strong advocate for the minimum viable test mindset and framework, is being able to over communicate what you're learning, how you're growing, and how you're transforming your business month over month is incredibly important. But also having boundaries where you move on when it's clear that there's nothing that you can do to shift the energy with this investor. Though, like we said, relationships are exactly that. A no today might actually just be a not now. But making sure that you have boundaries in place about where the line is for you is really important. And proactivity is huge. There are some great examples here from some founders around the way they've reframed the questions, where an investor might say, "This is a really hot space. How do you plan to differentiate in the segment?" And using that as an opportunity to take it as a market signal that this is a great place to pursue, and then emphasizing your unique skills and qualities to pursue this market. And this is a favorite example is one founder verbatim said that the trick is gently showing them how stupid or unfair the question is by bridging into the prize so that the answer to that question is so self-evident. And you can read more as you look through the deck later about what that means. So let's talk briefly about the operations plan. For many first-time founders, if you haven't fundraised before, it can be totally shocking to see exactly how much work it takes to fundraise and how you need to have an entire operating system for that work as if you're starting a whole other second company. We won't have time to do a deep dive into a full operations plan for your fundraise, but let's talk at a high level about what this means. So first, I know that some of you had questions about what should actually be in a data room. There are varying opinions on this, but this is the way we set up data rooms at Further Faster. Always password protected, using platforms like DocuSend, and there's also other platforms you might use, but we really do want to password protect our data and be further along in the conversation before we give access to the full data room. But when it comes to the minimum viable testing, you'll want to demonstrate that you know your user better than anyone and you have a full awareness of the journey that you're taking them on. So having your user personas and your journey map in the data room is really important, particularly at the early stage. Showing that you've got rigor around your market sizing, segmentation, and analysis, your competitive analysis, and I want to be clear that for competitive analysis, it's not just your direct competitors. It's all of your indirect competitors, both current and prospective. Because if someone's got a problem today, odds are they are solving it. If not with a direct one-to-one competitor, there's some type of duct tape toothpick solution that they're using because they need to create some kind of ease in their lives. A big fan of doing a product demo video in your data room, whether that's a Loom or some other way that you record it. Maybe it's through a Zoom screen share. But when an investment committee meets, not everyone on the IC has necessarily gotten the chance to meet you or see the product. So we want the entire IC to be able to experience the product and see why it's such a strong opportunity. Of course, the revenue model is huge. Your revenue model and your projections, your P&L, and your balance sheet. Even if you're in the earliest days, just showing that you've got the infrastructure built out is really important, along with your cap table and your term sheets. There's always questions around how to prioritize. And this is, again, another operational question, much like how you might operationalize your sales if you're a B2B company. How do you determine who a good lead is for you? How do you prioritize that universe of leads? And then how do you move through it? This is a very reductionist view on how you build and prioritize your list. But the top line note here is that spray and pray isn't a smart use of time or energy. Spending time going out to every investor that you can find, while in the short term might seem easier than culling through a list, actually wastes a lot of time and energy once you realize that you're having conversations that don't go anywhere, assuming you can even get to the conversation with the investor. Your list at this stage should be focused on aligned and investors who have an investment thesis that matches your focus area or your identity. So you might be in healthcare, and it wouldn't be a smart use of your time to be reaching out to CPG investors. Who invests in the category where you're building? Or if you are a woman founder, which I imagine many of us here today are, making sure that if you are pursuing VCs that have a thesis focused on women investors, that we're also doing a little bit more diligence to make sure that the other facets of the thesis are a match. Stage is hugely important too. If you're a pre-seed founder in healthcare, reaching out to a Series A or Series B healthcare fund isn't going to be the way that you optimize for this round of capital. And also, values and culture alignment is huge. At this stage, in the pre-seed, the Series A universe, when you allow someone to invest in you, they become essential to your growth. They can make or break where you go as a company, and you want to make sure that there's values and culture alignment. And I really want to emphasize something that I just said there, because I could sneak it under the radar, but I want to underscore that you aren't lucky to receive capital from an investor. An investor is lucky to have the opportunity to invest in you. And that's what we mean when we talk about values and culture alignment, is making sure that you're finding a partner who recognizes that there's something really special about what you're building, and they're just as excited about the vision with you. And then there's other things to consider. Some of the things like potential warm intro, that might have a higher priority because it might be easier to get to that investor or that firm. Or if they've invested in other companies, that would be a signal that you'd be a right match for them. And then nurturing the relationship. Much in the way that you want to nurture any lead that comes in for your product, you want to nurture the relationships that you're building with your investors. So I already talked about making contact before you're ready to raise, but also updating and maintaining a CRM with all of these relationships and the touch points that you're making is huge. Even a spreadsheet will do in the earliest days, or using a free tool like HubSpot to help keep you organized and reminding you when to reach out with touch points, sending reminder emails or sending update emails in a easier way. Create that system for yourself to track and maintain the relationships. We also encourage you to send routine investor update emails. Now, sometimes it can take people 6 months to realize that even if it's a not right now, keeping prospective investors in the loop at least once a month with insights about where you're at and where you're growing is really huge to giving them line of sight into the way that you are growing and making progress. So what could or should be included there is what you're testing today, underscoring that minimum viable testing mindset, what you're learning from your previous tests and how you're applying those learnings. Does it mean that you're developing a new feature set? Does it mean that you're trying a new marketing campaign? Highlight those big wins that emerge from the testing. Though we want to be honest, if we've learned something that means we're making a micro or nano pivot, we also want to talk about the big wins that are emerging. And maybe you just closed your round, or maybe you've got 100 new users over the course of the past month, and your daily active user rate has doubled. Shout that out, and also shout out the people who've been supporting you. Not necessarily investors, but certainly your investors. It could be a power user who gave you a great review. It could be a member of your team that worked extra hard to ship a new feature. And then also let people in and let them support you. If you're looking for a new a new front end developer, or you're looking for a growth marketing specialist, put those asks out to your investor update email list. And your investor update email list doesn't need to be limited just to investors. It can be other influencers in the ecosystem, whether that's people from entrepreneurial support organizations or operators or other founders in your network. Include people who want to invest time or capital in seeing you succeed in that update email. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I'd be thrilled, as I mentioned a couple of times, to keep the conversation going. This QR code is a way that you can book more time if there's something that we sparked today that you want to dig deeper on. There's also my email address, and I would love to take time to answer any questions that you might be holding. You can use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen, or use the chat function, whichever is easiest for you. Yeah, great question in the Q&A section about percentages for prevention versus promotion. I just shared this on Twitter earlier today, but 67% of questions posed to male entrepreneurs focused on vision or promotion, and 66% of questions posed to female founders were prevention focused. And this is based on Dana Kanze's research at London Business School in 2017. She gives a TED Talk on this topic, and it's pretty well documented. So I hope that if this wasn't on your radar, it sparks a thread for you to go dig deeper on. There is a copy of the research available. I can share one spot where you can access it through a blog in terms of this specific data set around prevention versus promotion questions, the stat that I cited. I just put the link in chat, but the data from this research, it can be found in a few different places. Harvard also recently did some research on prevention versus promotion questions, where they had a research team listen in on different pitches of both male-founded and female-founded teams, and there's some good insights through that research. And I agree. It's not surprising, but somehow still shocking that this exists. Great question from Manny in the chat about how this also maps to other founder identities that aren't the white male founder. I don't have data on that, and it does not seem like there's a ton of data out there around how prevention and promotion questions, what that looks like across other historically underestimated founder identities. But given what we know about the dearth of funding for anyone outside of the dominant founder archetype, I imagine, and anecdotally what I've heard, is that this prevention promotion question dilemma exists across all underestimated founders. And Sasha, yes, there will be a recording available through Twin Cities Startup Week in 3 to 4 weeks. Once we have that link, we'll share it. And I imagine Twin Cities Startup Week will also be sharing it. But if there's a question that you're holding that is more urgent than that 3 or 4 week time horizon, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to chat. Great question around neurodiversity. The answer that I have there is kind of a non-answer. I think it varies based on the founder themselves, the vertical that they're pursuing, and their previous professional experience in the industry. In certain spaces, I've seen neurodiverse founders find their footing in a way where they are able to position their neurodiversity as an advantage point. Anecdotally, I will share that I've read some data, though we know not all data is good data, but I've read some studies that indicate that neurodiverse founders can have a tendency to outperform neurotypical founders, but I don't want to cite that as accurate data, but there's certainly some research out there. I'm cognizant of time. I know that there are so many other great sessions that you have to attend today. I'm so grateful that you shared part of your Twin Cities Startup Week experience with me online this afternoon. I hope that you're finding incredible, enriching opportunities throughout the course of the week. Like I said, I hope this is just the first touch point for us. Please do reach out. I genuinely mean it when I say that I'm here to be an advocate, an ally for you as you build and you grow. I'm on LinkedIn and on Twitter. My email address and the link for office hours are posted here. I'm really excited to see all of you win and succeed in whatever that you plan to do, whether it's pursuing venture capital or finding other ways to bring your big ideas to life. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. And thank you to Twin Cities Startup Week for including me in this incredible event. Bye, everyone. Thank you.